Next slide, please. Okay, well now here's one of Dow's prints. And it's weird seeing it, you know, poster size on this wall, because his prints traditionally are about this big. They're exquisite. But when you look at his prints, and they're done in the 1890s, and he did them on Cape Cod, he did them in Ipswich, Mass in particular, and Cape Ann. They really prefigure the Provincetown prints in many ways, I think, or at least the feeling of the prints that were made in Provincetown. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I should say, she teaches for a year at the Velton School for Girls, and she basically teaches art composition and a little art history and such. But she really, you can tell that she's very much involved in nature, in natural subject matter. And there's a lecture given in her final class by a woman who stresses the importance of really looking at nature, saying things like, notice the way the frond of the flower, you know, shifts in the breeze. Lie down on the ground and look at the way the sun filters through the leaves and changes the color. And she really, it's as if this lecture, she takes it into her memory, into her heart, and that's the way her work develops. Well, so that's about 1900, 1901 we're talking, and she's at the Velton School. Actually, James Roy Hopkins, whom she had met at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, he was a young art student, he had gone off to Paris. I should back up. He's from Mechanicsburg, Ohio, by the way, very near Springfield. All these interesting patterns that weave together. He had gone to Paris and studied at the Académie Colarossi for one, I think the Académie Julian for a while, but they had obviously formed a relationship, and he comes back from Paris, and in September of 1904, they married. Edna Boies and James Roy Hopkins married. Now, her father, back in Hudson, Michigan, the banker, it said that he was rather miserly. So he had stored up a lot of money, and he gives James an around-the-world tour, but he says, but I'm going to come with you. So that must have been a lot of fun. But anyway, there's a wonderful picture that Debbie Layton lent us for the use, and this great, great bouquet, appropriately, of flowers, this magnificent hat, and here they are, ready to start off their trip. And they went to Egypt, they went to Asia, to Japan, and it was in Japan that we actually had photographs of her with Japanese print masters. So she actually studied traditional Japanese printmaking techniques while she was in Japan. And that really is the grounding. I mean, if you're going to make woodblock prints, there's no better place to know what you're doing than in Japan, because they know how to make woodblock prints. There's no doubt about it. So the young couple, after their around the world tour in 1905, next slide please, they go to Paris, and they establish themselves among the many, many American artists who leave the United States for the sophistication and the magnificent, exciting trends of art that were going on. And remember that the Salon d'Automne, in which Matisse introduces the painting of his wife with green stripe down her nose, that's 1905. So the fauve period starts in 1905. So color and this sort of wild energy is really in the avant-garde in Paris at the time. Next slide, please. So interesting that here in Paris, with all this wild excitement going on, one of the first prints that she makes, and this might be a bit earlier, but I'll have to tell you, sort of a disclaimer for much about Edna. There is so little known about her. Putting the picture of her together is a bit like looking at a jigsaw puzzle with about a third of the pieces missing. You feel you've got the picture, but there are definite holes in it. And that's because she did not, well, if she kept a day book or a journal or some sort of a guidebook of what she was doing and when she did it, and the prints she made, and how many prints she did, editions, it's gone. And it could be that it's lost, it could be that her husband threw it away, although I don't think maliciously. It's just, there is much about Hopkins that's missing. And so the dating of her prints is in some ways an imperfect art, but it's something we try to do. At least it gives a sense of you know, when in her career something falls. Anyway, so with all of this wild art going on in Paris, she makes this incredibly slavish imitation of Japanese prints. Next slide, please. Because I'll give you an example here. Here's a hokusai, you know, an 18th century, 19th century print. And boy, that, you know, this could pass for a hokusai. So it shows that she's got the technique down very early on. But, and in Paris, of course, people collected Japanese prints. There were great private collections, public collections. Japanese art had been very influential in the late 19th century. So this is kind of a retardataire image. But next slide, please. Again, an early image. Oh, this is the first instance where she uses the famous peapod chop. And this becomes her chop, which is just like the Japanese artists would put their seal or stamp on a print. And it's actually a peapod that I think I've got to blow up a bit later. But again, this image is very typically Japanese, even with this roll of color, this sort of fade of color, pure Japanese print. Next, please. But there starts to be a change in her work, and she must know that she's got to get out of this. She can't just copy or make prints that look just like Japanese prints. So she starts making prints that have a certain freedom, that she's really looking at nature, and she's really following the lecture that she heard at the Belton School, her final year of teaching. And she produces a remarkable body of work from about 1906 to about 1910 or so, or really right before the First World War breaks out. So we'll look at a number of these images here. Next slides, please. This is a really famous image that must have been sought after because it's one image that I know of that's in a number of collections in the United States, and the edition number is fairly high. We'll talk about that in a moment too. Wonderful pepper berries. You know, she still uses the Japanese sensibility of the main object sort of thrust forward in the picture plane, with sort of a subtlety and variety of focus on the object, and then a very neutral background, a very blank background. This, again, Martha Wesley Dow, Noton, balance of subject with negative space and positive space. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the peapod chop. And now, why she used the peapod, I cannot tell you. But, you know, this is the pod itself hanging on the stem. And she used it for about that early period in France. Again, it's a nod to Japanese prints, but, you know, eventually she stops using it. And it shows that Edna, she evolves really very quickly. Her work, although she does a large number of florals in Paris, it's like you can tell that she's not just getting stuck in a rut. I think she always pulls herself out of that and she moves forward. This is a stamp that you encounter quite often in these Paris prints on the back of the prints. And it's French for, it's tiré à 50. It means 50 impressions, 50 pullings. So her aspiration in these editions of prints for each image would be that she was hoping to make 50 of them, and then obviously she would probably write the number here, so it would be number 1 of 50, number 2 of 50. But more often than not, that number will occur in the lower margin of the print. Often, sometimes not. I've even seen prints where people have tried to erase the number. I don't know why, but that's pretty strange. Next, please. This is an interesting print for the reason that the print itself is rather simple. It's kind of unassuming, but it's certainly got the peapod chop. It also occurs with this really interesting sort of foil mat around it, which you do find on some of her prints. And I think Edna did it. I think Edna wanted that foil paper mat on the work. Again, it looks like the silk backgrounds you find in Japanese scroll paintings. It's got the chop. But this image, actually, she went out on a sort of an interesting commercial venture. I believe she sent the blocks to London, And a number of prints were pulled from the blocks, but not by her, and they were then inserted, they were tipped into a magazine called The Bibliophile in 1908. And you could buy, if you bought that Bibliophile, you got one of these sort of like pseudo Hopkins. I mean, they were made from her blocks, but probably not by her. But the magazine said, if you want the deluxe edition, you could pay so much to the Bibliophile, and presumably you get a real Hopkins print. And the difference in the two editions is the Bibliophile has a circular chop, and her prints have the regular rectangular chop. But that's just 1 year. That just happens once. That's the only print of that nature I've found. Next slide, please. The thing that with Hopkins, beside the fact that it's very difficult really to say specifically, except in rare occasions, when something was made or how many were made. One thing is she loved experimentation, and she obviously hated to be fenced in by expectation or by tradition, I would say. You could tell that once she starts out really getting her grasp of what she's doing, she's really reached her stride in printmaking. She's become a mature artist, I think, very quickly. And she starts experimenting a great deal. So here you have an instance where this print exists without this dark background. And it could be, well, you say, maybe she didn't print the dark background in this, maybe she just never got around to doing this block. I don't know, because it's entirely within the realm of possibility that Hopkins just wanted to see, okay, I like this, but let's see what it's like on a white background. Or maybe she was intending on changing and using a different color background. So you really can't say. It's difficult. I ought to say that all of these prints up until 1915 are traditional Japanese methods where each color is a separate wood block. I know most of you probably know the block technique, but for those of you, maybe just it's very worth reminding. Each one of these prints, each color has to be a different block. So you just count how many colors there are in the print, and you'll know how many blocks she had to do to produce them. And they generally were cherry wood blocks. There's a wonderful letter that's in Provincetown Art Museum's Art Association's collection where she talks about her technique. And she said in Paris she used cherry, which is a very hard wood that would require a lot of pressure and work to carve the blocks. Anyway, next slide, please. Here's an interesting study that's very sort of tenuous, just not great detail, but it shows that this process of how she made her prints really was extremely meticulous. She starts out by just a quick study in someone's garden. I'm going to raise an interesting point too. It's traditionally in the literature about Hopkins, and I think it's oral tradition pretty much from the Hopkins extended family, that she and James Roy were very close friends of Claude Monet. Well, that would really be something, and that they went out to Giverny all of the time, that Giverny, they were frequent guests. Well, it's interesting because there's really no primary source material that corroborates that. And, you can't say that it's not true, because it could be true. And there's a tantalizing, interesting Ohio connection. I don't know how many of you know Monet's life very well, but the American Impressionist artist Theodore Butler was actually born in Columbus, Ohio, and he had the amazing, or maybe odd, luck to marry two of Monet's stepdaughters in succession. Amazing. He first marries Suzanne Rochedet Monet. He has 2 children with her. She dies soon after the birth of their second child. And as was the practice in sort of the 19th century, one of her sisters then sort of steps in to take care of her during her last years and the children, and she ends up marrying Butler as well after the sister's death. Now Butler from Columbus and James Roy Hopkins from Mechanicsburg, just like 40 miles away or so, they may have known each other. They also went to the same art academy, although they not the same years. But there's a good chance that the Butlers and the Hopkinses did know each other. It would be great to find that corroboration. I haven't, but so who knows? These iris may have been from Giverny. I mean, it's possible. It's quite possible. Next slide, please. A magnificent work. This is really, I think, one of many people's favorites, certainly one of mine, that shows the inclusion of an insect within this very beautiful, very graceful work. And again, I'll just stress that sense of balance. You have something as delicate as this spider web, but then the boldness of that background blue, or this boldness of the leaf and the crumpled leaf. And she's sort of constant. She never does just what's sort of pretty or typically pretty or picturesque. There's always a quirkiness. That dried dead leaf is a wonderful touch. Next, please. Fuchsia, great work. Just trying to show you more, but I will go through these. Next, please. Hollyhocks, wonderful. This kind of, again, this close-up and explosive. Again, I think these are becoming more and more bold, certainly, and abstract as well. Whether intentionally or what, but the forms, the shapes, they're moving away from that sort of purity, maybe, of showing individual petals, and you can tell that she's comfortable working within a certain framework of abstraction. Next, please. Another great work, this explosive dahlia, and these more delicate petals of these other flowers. The unusual mottled backgrounds that you encounter in many of her works. It turns out from the letter she wrote, she used both oil-based ink, and then when she came to the United States in 1914, she started using watercolor as well. It's difficult to know sometimes if she's overlaying, but I think a lot of these maybe have different colors overlaid, so that would require maybe 2 blocks for the background. Well, I think next slide. And we've got another one that's from Columbus's collection. Again, this really wonderful overall, patterning and just quite striking. Next, please. Yeah, great image. She uses the wood grain. She's not afraid to let the wood grain come through. And these are very Japanese technique, something that she's using. She's actually letting the technique show itself. This is wood. This isn't linoleum or some other material. The grain of the wood is quite important. Next, please. Okay. Well, we hit 1914, and World War I, of course, is breaking out, and that is the bell for all Americans to return home. And pretty much that's what those Americans did. They came home, and what's interesting was, of course, America didn't enter the war until quite late. And so back here in the States, it was still kind of fun. And a lot of artists, a group of artists who returned, including Mars and Squire, come to Provincetown. So they end up here, and I don't need to tell you about your town. It's a great place. It's made for art, and it's just a magnet for artists. And so Mars and Squire are here. And the Hopkinses actually returned to Cincinnati because James had been offered a teaching job at the Art Academy. And Edna liked Cincinnati. It was really a very cultured city. It's a beautiful city. And I think they were well appreciated when they stayed there. But Mars and Squire, who had been very close friends, they said, well, look, come and visit us. There's all these printmakers here. So Edna goes to Provincetown in 1915, and her husband, James, in that summer, goes down to Kentucky. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So while she's here, next slide, please, she does just a handful of works, but they're really magnificent works. Now, I mentioned Dow's prints, and I think Arthur Wesley Dow, if you think of Dow and you look at them, you'll see, I think, a sympathetic vibration with Hopkins' works. There's actually one of her prints over in the corner here, and I think there's another one over here that she did in Provincetown, and she didn't do many. But what I find really curious about them, next slide, please, is the fact that while the prints of almost all of her contemporaries of that core group of the Provincetown printers, Mars, Squire, McNichols, Chafee, Nordfeld, of course, and I'm missing one. McMillan, thank you. All of them have figures in their work. Their work includes the human figure. And they're about the town. I mean, let's face it, the town was full of people. It was full of artists. It was full of tourists. It was full of bohemians. It was full of fishermen and townspeople. And, you know, it's kind of hard to imagine a town scene where there's not somebody doing something, unless, you know, it's just so beastly hot that nobody's out. No, maybe it was just hot that day. But I do think that her work kind of resonates in a different way. She's really interested in the place, and next please. Yeah, she's really more interested in the formal characteristics of these landscapes or townscapes that she's creating. And again, I think that's a much more it's a serious approach to art. Now, I'm not saying that the others weren't serious, but you know, for Hopkins, if you included people, or you had you know, people talking over a fence or walking arm in arm down the street, suddenly the work moves into a different realm. It becomes a little more anecdotal. It's a little different. There's a narrative suddenly with the connection of the people in the print. And I think the fact that she keeps all people out, there's just a much more kind of serious look at what she's doing. They really are about the forms and the shapes and how they relate. Next, please. This one in particular, I mean, I just think this is really phenomenal work. This is actually, I mean, this is a slide, of course. I think the original has faded some, but this, I think, is, you know, very pale blue, so it's the water, it's the beach, it's dunes, and then some houses, and you get this really great progression of the way space telescopes here on the cave. I mean, you really feel that she's experienced what it's like to walk along, you know, the beach and the dunes, and to sort of feel that, you know, that feeling, that moonscape feeling that the cave can have. So these were very important works, and of course it's in Provincetown that she learns the white line method. Is there anybody in the group here who doesn't know what the white line method is? I mean, please feel free to say it. Good. I don't have to explain, but so she learns that. She's one of the group actually that invents it. I mean, it's funny that Nordfeld is generally credited as having invented, I think, but I think it's sort of a group, it's a collaborative work, and I think, you know, certainly Hopkins is thought to be right in there in this. And one of the benefits of working on just one block instead of 5 or 6 or 10, you're conserving materials. And she can't get the cherry blocks anymore, so she's using pine. Next, please. I just wanted to compare with Lozelle. This is much later than Hopkins. You know, Hopkins prints are from about 1915 or so. And, you know, Lozelle is very interested in cubism. So, you know, certainly Lozelle, but I think there's that similarity. There are no people, there's no narrative, it's really about the composition. So there is that strong similarity, I think, between Hopkins' work and Lozelle's. Next, please. A great work, I think, that she did around this time, but not necessarily white line. And something to note in these prints, again, this experimental nature of her work. Sometimes you'll find a work such as Trumpet Vine, where there are elements that are white lined. There's a center group of flowers that is white lined, where the rest of the print is traditional multi-block. So she's not adverse to combining the two woodblock techniques, which is quite amazing. Next, please. Oh, this is a study that's actually in the Springfield Museum of Art for garden flowers. And it shows that, you know, while her prints look very effortless, while she did experiment in changing different colors, she certainly starts out with a very methodical or very plan. She's got a plan as to where she's going to put different colors. And it's sort of the blueprint that then she can vary from. So, next slide, please. I just threw this Demeth in because of, you know, he's here also around the same time. And certainly, while this doesn't look like an Edna Boies Hopkins, I think there's there's a little something. You know, it's interesting that Demuth was so interested in flowers and in floral works as well. And I don't know if they knew each other. I don't know if Demuth knew the printers that well, but I'm just saying there are certainly similarities. I think I repeat the next slide is the garden flowers again. If you want to go, yeah. Just sort of something to think about. And next slide, please. Saucy Dahlia, just again to show you working process. This is an image I knew. Again, you know, she's getting really bold here. She's sort of paring away a lot of the fussiness of the prints, and she's really coming down to these big, bold shapes. And, you know, they're getting pretty abstract in a way. Next slide, please. This is interesting. I didn't know until, you know, I found out from this gallery in Boston, they had a grisaille, that's to say a monochromatic version of Saucy Dahlias on inferior paper. It's basically on cheap paper, which immediately says to me, well, she did this kind of as a study, again, like Arthur Wesley Dow would say, how are the darks and the lights balancing? Where's the noton in this? Where's the yin and yang? And so she did these monochromatic studies before she probably started planning what actual colors she was going to do. But this is the only one of all of her 74 that I found one of these four. So she probably destroyed them. It's amazing that it still exists. Next, please. Okay, this is a major moment in their lives. I told you that James had gone down to Cumberland Falls in 1950. He returned in 1916 when Edna came back to Provincetown. But in 1917, she goes down to the Brunson Inn with him down in the sticks in Kentucky, at the Brunson Inn, which was owned by a coal magnate from Michigan, a Mr. Stearns, and it was a lodge and cabins that were really meant to be. They were for the rich people from Cincinnati and Louisville to go stay and to rough it out in the wilds. And it actually took like 4 hours on a mule cart to get from the nearest railway station to the Brunson Inn. But the inn, which is long since burned down, was right there at the falls. And James obviously had fallen in love with the area. He liked the people. And Edna, too, falls in love with this milieu. And she ends up doing a series of work that's. She didn't do any figures while she was in Provincetown, which she does almost all figures in Kentucky. So suddenly the figure becomes a big part of her work. But curiously too, the figures rarely look at us. They're often turned away or they're often involved in something else. We know who this man is. His name is Andy Vanover, and he was the caretaker at the Brunson Inn. He was a preacher, he was a jack of all trades. He had a big family that appear in a couple of the prints, but it's, next slide, please. This is presumably one of Andy's family members and a little girl. James Roy Hopkins does a series of paintings, and he actually, this little girl and another girl, but the little girl holding the apple, they're in his oil painting. So they're actually sharing subject matter. It's an amazing kind of moment that for the husband and wife artist team, that this must have been a great exciting place for them to work. Next, please. While these women, I don't know, the woman with the bonnet, that certainly looks like a bonnet that somebody, you know, in Kentucky might wear. I think these women, you know, she's got her galoshes on probably or something. I think these are probably women from Cincinnati. These are more tourists who are staying at the inn that are out sightseeing. So even though it's called Mountain Women, they're not what we would kind of think of as, you know, Beverly Hillbillies, mountain women. They're probably enjoying the unspoiled beauties of rural Kentucky. But, you know, wonderful little Japanese touch, I think, this pine branch, this great, you know, she never gets Japanese art out of her system. That's probably a good thing. Next slide, please. Now, I do want to say, and I think it's quite interesting, you know, how did these things come about? I mean, she's never done any figurative work before. Well, Nordfeld, here in Provincetown, the year before, was doing these figurative work, and, you know, these women sort of engaged in some kind of a conversation, some relationship. I think they're probably influential in a certain way for subject. I think this was like Edna goes, well, I can do figures. Sure, I can do figures. And while she was in France, there was the Pont-Aven school. This was the school of artists around Paul Gauguin, who went into Brittany. Brittany, if you don't know, at the time was certainly a lot like rural Kentucky in France. I mean, this was, the peasants that lived in Brittany, their lifestyles hadn't probably changed for how many hundreds of years, very rural. And so this figure is very much like the figure in the previous slide of the woman walking with the basket over her arm. I just add that as it shows that Edna's not working in a vacuum by any means. She's aware of what's gone on. She's aware of the work of her colleagues. She's aware of work that she knew in France. And it's all weaving, that success. All artists work by looking at other artists and by seeing what other people have done. And you're either often reacting against or you're reacting to. I mean, it's what life is about. It's that sort of weaving together of what we respond to, positively and negatively. And I think Edna's a great example of how she transplants these experiences into rural Kentucky in 1917. And I'll stress, at a time when really no other American artists had looked at America's heartland. It wasn't until, 15 years, 20 years later, that Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton are making scenes of American farmers, baling hay and things like that. The School of American Regionalism. I mean, this is really quite radical that she's doing, that she and James both are doing work down in Appalachia, in Kentucky. Next, please. Here's Andy pulling a boat out of the river. Next slide, please. This is probably one of her most sought-after works. It's just a great piece when you look at it in the flesh, in the paper, I should say. Just dynamically, she knows that the woodblock means that you have to work flatly, but she can create such an amazing range of movement and depth within the pictorial plane. I mean, Andy's clearly going down this little path, but the mule is just turning. She's just kind of capturing the mule just at this moment. So she implies the movement in a static, very simplified image that's, a sign of great talent. Next slide, please. Oh, these are wonderful. This is interesting because I think for a long time people thought that this was from Provincetown, but there aren't any dunes that are that big and there aren't any boulders out in the water here that I know of. So this is again, we know that these are scenes from Provincetown. And you'll know that a lot of her prints have multiple titles, and I document them whenever possible. So it's interesting. I prefer Cascades because that's what I think it is, or I should say I really know it is. This is water going over one of the rough, rocky edges of the falls at Cumberland. But it has the other title, The Waves, because I think people have seen it and think that it's the waves crashing on the beach in Provincetown. But in fact, these are works. We actually know who these people are. These prints are number one, and they are from a private collection in Cincinnati. And it's the family of the forebears of the current owner, who were good friends of the Hopkinses and who went down to Cumberland Falls with them that summer. And that's them frolicking in the water. That's the grandmother and great aunt of the current owner. She said, "Oh, that's my great grandma. My grandma wrote right there, and great aunt." I mean, it's amazing that personal connection of the work. And these are extremely rare works, though, and marvelous works at that too. Next, please. A couple works she did from Cape Cod that show that she and James actually did winter here occasionally. I don't think they came here that often, but certainly at one time or other they did. They were here in the wintertime, which must have been quite something in days before electrical or gas heat and fleece coats and all of that. But, next, please. Now we're getting late, and we're getting to the point where really Edna her arthritis had become extremely bad, and it was obviously getting more difficult for her to carve blocks. This print, I think, is still pretty strong, and I'm still a little conflicted about the date. It may be closer to maybe 18 or so, 1918, 19. I'm not sure, but these leaf forms, which are extremely, tree forms are very abstract. I think in this print in particular, she's lost a bit of the subtlety. She's lost some of the control of cutting the block, and I think that's probably due to her arthritis. She and James were also in a car accident in Florida, and each one of them suffered a broken arm or wrist, which must have made it even harder for her. So really, we're drawing near to the end of her career now. Although she's had a very successful career in showing her work, in exhibiting. She is extremely well known. She and James opened an art school in Provincetown in 1923 or 24, and it's short-lived, but they actually both are working here. Next slide, please. Here's another floral. She returns to doing some floral works. Again, they're larger, they're bolder, they're these sort of strange, again, sort of shapes, which are a little reminiscent of Blanche Lazelle's kind of fractured cubist areas. I think it's kind of interesting. But she's getting a lot bolder, too, in the way she makes the veins of philodendron or whatever this is. Next, please. And so, to end, really, I want to show you, really within a period of just about 20 years or less, she goes from something that is so controlled, so traditionally Japanese in every way, subject matter, technique, the tradition, to something, explosive, bold, modern, flat, abstracted, and yet, many of the same concerns, negative, positive, negative, positive. Even oddly enough, the same color scheme in these two works, I think, is quite kind of coincidental, but really quite wonderful. And the next slide, please. So she really stops printmaking about 1923 or so. She lives until 1927, and you may say, well, what did she do for the rest of her life? She traveled a great deal. She and James lived in any number of places. They had homes, they had an apartment in Cincinnati. James, in 1923, was asked to be the chairman of the art department, to found the art department at Ohio State University in Columbus. There's Hopkins Hall to commemorate him. So she went to Columbus, although I don't think she liked Columbus at all. I hate to say it. She didn't want to be a faculty wife. That was not Edna's style. She'd go to visit her family in Michigan. She had an apartment and a studio in Manhattan, and they maintained an apartment in Paris. And after World War I ended, she went back to Paris, as did Mars and Squire, and James would return to Paris as well. I mean, it's an amazing life, and I have to say, they were very fortunate. They were well-to-do, so they didn't have to sell their art to live. But I think that was really liberating for them, because they could really make the art that they wanted to. And in Edna's instance, I think it was extremely important because it allowed her to do what she wanted when she wanted. And so she traveled, she continued to exhibit her prints, and we actually know that she continued to take a few art courses at the Art Academy of Cincinnati. We found a supplemental records card just recently in the Cincinnati archives that shows that she was taking classes in the 1920s. It's interesting, an accomplished artist who wants to continue to work. I even know that she did a few oil paintings later on, but I have to tell you that's not what she was meant to do. They're just not successful, and I I think any critic would be honest and say that. I mean, any art historian. She was a consummate printmaker, and that was what her life was about. And even though she painted, it was easier to paint than to carve those hard wood blocks. So sadly, she dies. She was 66 when she died. She died of cancer in Detroit. To set the record straight, many of the source materials that said she died in New York City, but she actually dies in Detroit. And she was cremated, and the family says that her ashes were strewn in Lake Michigan. Now, actually, I think it might have been a lake in Michigan somewhere. We don't know which one. Because James and his brother, Harold, were avid fishermen. And when James and his brother would go up to Michigan to fish, he would often tell people, I'm going up to visit Edgar. It was really poignant. James never remarried. He lived another 30 years. And he finished out his life after he left Ohio State University. He went back to his family's homestead in Mechanicsburg and lived there, very, I think, happily, probably living with a lot of memories. And the house was hung with Edna's prints. I know that for a fact because when I went back to talk to one of the remaining Hopkins family members, she said, well, I sold all of my Hopkins prints. I said, you did? Oh, no, you know. And I said, well, could I see the house? I just love to see the whole house if I could. I just want to get a feeling of where they were when Edna would come to visit, because she would scandalize the people in Mechanicsburg. She had flaming red hair, as Debbie Lake will tell you. She had this henna red hair. She wore pants. She smoked cigarettes. Or she wore these huge white-brimmed hats. I guess she liked to hike. She liked walking. And so she didn't mind probably going to Mechanicsburg for a while. It's very rural. It's farms. And, but I guess the people thought that she was really odd. And this last remaining family member in Mechanicsburg was rather put out by Edna. She thought she was just too scandalous. But anyway, we walked around the house, and we were up in the bedroom, and I was like, what's that print over there? And she said, oh, I don't know, that's not Edna. And I said, I think it is. And it turns out it was acacia. It's one of those really early prints. So I'm like, you didn't sell them all. Anyway, it's now with the family member. But I just have to say, this has been an amazing project. It's been great to get to know Edna and her work. I think those people who know her, you know, obviously find the deepest respect for her. And I hope, I mean, I was saying to Debbie, I know this project isn't over, really. You know, this is sort of the high point at this moment, but I think it's going to continue. I think other prints will be found. Maybe we'll find that date book, that journal, that record, and you know, there'll be another chapter, another book, an article, or something. You know, the next step in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris is there. I mean, it's 4 o'clock. You know, that's been an hour. Do anybody have any real salient questions, or I'd be glad to
I have a big question.
Sure.
Can you describe the picture over there?
Oh, this is really great because William Pointer, who's a Cincinnati photographer, did these photographs of Edna in 1917. The reason we know is because that's the year she and James went to Cumberland Falls. There's another one in the other room of her looking out at the viewer, and she's working on the print of Andy and his mule, or the mountaineer, whatever, the one right back there on the wall. So you know it's 1917. This work, amazingly, was discovered literally behind a bookcase in one of the extended family members' homes about 3 years ago. It belonged to the family member's wife, who was really actually, she was sort of a surrogate daughter to the Hopkinses. The Hopkinses, Edna let her use her apartment in New York while she was going to school at Columbia. Edna and James would send her money. You know, there are letters that say, you know, why don't you buy yourself a new dress, or, you know, I want you to have some fun now that it's not all work and play. Anyway, this ended up in that particular family member's possession, but it had fallen behind a bookcase. And it just happened that the husband, I don't know what he did. He moved the bookcase for some reason and he found it. He called in, he goes, you'll never, I just found this photograph, you won't believe it. And I'm like, great, well, could you send me a photo? I said, go to Kinko's and get a photocopy and send it to me. And when I saw this is phenomenal, because this is the one print that I have never seen before. I knew it existed, because in the records of the Cincinnati Art Museum, I'll tell you, Boston has her largest collection of prints, followed by Cincinnati, because Cincinnati bought 18 of her prints in 1917, in December, well, after her big show there, and a lot of them were these Cumberland prints. And then Springfield Museum of Art in Springfield has the third largest public museum collection of her work. But this work, which is 3 mules and riders, 3 donkeys and riders, is listed in Cincinnati's permanent collection. It's in their records, but the print is not there. The card is annotated missing. And what happened is, it's annotated that James borrowed it for a lecture or something, and if he returned it to the museum and never made it back to that particular print box in the print room, it's gone. And I've never seen it. Nobody's ever seen the print, but this is the block. When you look at that block, you can tell it's 3 donkeys with riders on it. So it's like, boy, is that amazing. It's very strange, but quite a. They're great photographs.
I noticed in the 2 photographs when she was at the art schools, there were only 2 men in each class.
Yeah.
Was it because art was not really a career choice for men?
I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know exactly what the class was that she was taking, but I think that it might have been particularly for composition and design and maybe not a painting class.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. I think at the time, at the turn of the century, if you were a painter, you probably were more likely a man, and maybe, I don't know. Or it's odd that was predominantly women in the class. And it's predominantly women printmakers at the time, too. Let's face it, except for Nordfeld and Bauman, there are probably others that I'm not thinking of, but many of these. Yeah, it is so. But many of them are women. And I think it's easier, that it's more, I don't know why, more genteel. It's thought of as maybe, I hate to say it, but maybe at the time they thought less serious. I don't know. I think there's that hierarchy of painting, and within painting there's the hierarchy of painting of what you paint, or at least there was in the French Academy. And that sort of onus was on painters for a long time until the Impressionists finally sort of broke that down. But yeah, it's a good point, and I suppose it is a prejudice of sorts. Well, there's a lot. This is an extremely rich subject, and it's so greatly intertwined with Provincetown's history, and it's just fantastic that this exhibition, which opened at Columbus Museum of Art, and then went to Springfield, where I actually began the project in 2001, could end up here. Thank God, because it's what it's bringing in a home, really. So, well, actually, she's been in 3 of her homes, but I think probably this is the one of the 3 she really liked the best. Anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you.